Authenticity. It's what we value in friends and question in politicians. It's what we all want to see in other people. Authenticity is something we are very skeptical about when we think of corporations and their brands. Corporations, as a result, regard authenticity as a potential source of competitive advantage. If only someone could bottle authenticity. As it turns out, one industry is trying to do exactly that. It's the Canadian whisky industry. And my guest, Maxim Voronov, has been studying it to learn more about authenticity in a business context. Coming up, Schulich professor Maxim Voronov. Maxim, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Cam, for having me on your podcast.
Why don't you tell us who you are?
Great, happy to. My name is Maxim Voronov. I am a professor of sustainability and organization at Schulich School of Business in Toronto. I do research on social change at organizational, industry, and societal levels, and more broadly at the intersection of organizations and society. And I've done work on a variety of topics in different contexts. I'm particularly interested in how individuals and groups either promote or thwart change. I've also more recently gotten interested in understanding the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on organizations in public sector as well as in private sector. And a big stream of research of mine has been on authenticity, and that's what I'm here to talk about today.
Good. Well, tell me about this paper. I hinted at it in the introduction. Can you tell us about this particular study?
The name of this paper is Distilling Authenticity, Materiality and Narratives in Canadian Distilleries' Authenticity Work, which was published recently in Academy of Management Journal. And the paper is builds on my fairly long-standing interest in authenticity, which, of course, as your introduction mentioned, Cam, is such an important preoccupation of contemporary society.
Tell me just a little bit about
Sure.
why this matters for whiskey. Because when I think of whiskey, I think of Scotch. Right?
Of course.
Is that considered the authentic form of whiskey, and everybody else is catching up?
Well, that's a really interesting question, actually. Yeah, so, of course, Scotch whiskey is one of several major whiskey traditions. There are really four major ones. So there is Scotch, of course, there is bourbon, there is Canadian, and there is Japanese. And then there's, of course, other smaller whiskey producing regions. Incidentally, while oftentimes Scotch whiskey is seen as sort of pinnacle of authenticity, it is not necessarily more or less so. It may be the most famous one, right? So, in fact, some of the innovations that people sometimes attribute to Scotch whiskey, such as, for example, mandating that whiskey has to be aged for a minimum period in oak barrels, those are actually Canadian innovations. In fact, Canadians had been mandating aging whiskey in oak barrels longer than Scotch has, and Scotch has started doing so in response to Canadian moves. But your question kind of gets us into a more important kind of issue here, right? The authenticity, right? And the fact that oftentimes we tend to think of authenticity as something that's inherent to people or things, and in fact, it's actually in the eye of the beholder. Right. Of course, the very notion of authenticity is the audience's perception that an entity's sort of projection of images or communication is the same as their identity or consistent with their identity or consistent with their internal properties. Right. And but ultimately, it is the audiences that decide whether something is authentic or not.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I can try to be as authentic as I want in the classroom, but unless my students perceive me as authentic, it really doesn't matter.
Absolutely. That's exactly a great starting point. And that's really, there are, of course, different sort of conceptualizations of authenticity in various literatures. It's something that has been preoccupying not only business scholars, but really philosophers going back hundreds of years. But that is the perspective that I certainly align myself, and that I think that I find that particularly useful perspective for understanding how organizations can manage images of authenticity, because it sort of acknowledges that.
We just clarified that it doesn't matter what I try to do, unless my students understand me to be authentic,
Exactly.
I have failed. But now you're starting to talk about what corporations can do to manage authenticity. So you use this phrase, authenticity work, in your paper. Can you tell me what that's all about?
Absolutely, yes. So authenticity work refers to strategic efforts to manage audiences' perceptions of authenticity. In essence, trying to convince audiences that I am authentic, right? So basically, every time I try to convince my students that I'm authentic, every time as a marketer or as an influencer, I try to convince my audiences that I'm authentic, I am doing authenticity work.
Okay. So authenticity doesn't come for free, it's costly.
Absolutely.
Tell me more about how this connects to the business context.
So in the business context, of course, and again, as you mentioned in the introduction, authenticity can be an important source of strategic advantage. And so, of course, organizations do try to make claims that, whatever it is that they're doing is authentic, right? And we see these claims all over the place, right? So when you go to a restaurant, they claim to serve authentic X type of food, right? Or you're buying an authentic product, right? Or social media influencers, right? Basically they trade on authenticity, right? To the extent that they are valuable at all. It's really because they're able to convince a certain segment of population that they're authentic, and therefore they're worth following, for their lifestyle, for their opinion, whatever else, right? So it is enormously strategically valuable. But everybody is making those claims, right? And audiences are so inundated with those claims that they don't necessarily believe them anymore. And that's why authenticity work can be challenging, because organizations do not always succeed in convincing their audiences. And sometimes their authenticity claims plain backfire.
So what kinds of things matter when an organization is trying to establish authenticity?
Yeah, and that's really the core of this particular article. As a matter of fact, is that we found out that materiality is a really important influencer of what kind of authenticity claims organizations can make credibly. So, and by materiality we mean kind of culturally meaningful, culturally legitimated physical resources. So for example, in the context of whiskey industry, of course, it's the liquid itself, but also production equipment, distillery, sort of buildings and facilities, and even the human beings, the people involved with it. So, the whiskey makers.
Yes, you've seen the ads with the old Scottish whiskey makers hauling these barrels on their backs and so forth, or rolling them across the factory floor.
Absolutely.
Yes. It looks very authentic. I don't know if I could tell the difference between a commercial and actual production, though.
Absolutely. And of course, the actual production oftentimes is different, right? Particularly in this day and age, right? When we have a lot of machinery that can make a lot of things more efficient, but actually better, more reliable, more consistent as well, right? So that, when somebody does everything by hand, who knows, maybe today things will work out well, maybe tomorrow not so well. Machinery helps to eliminate a lot of the guesswork.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, like, you said that authenticity is about something that is kind of in the eye of the beholder. How does a corporation help people connect these images, these material resources, to that business Like, what can they do to make sure that it sticks with them?
Yeah, yeah, and this is a really important thing that kind of actually surprised us, as a matter of fact, right? Is that sometimes, as we all know, in business, corporations or businesses in general want to go to where the customers are, what the customers want, provide, what's currently popular and what's in demand, right? And so with whiskey, in particular, it's not always easy to do so. For the listeners who may not be familiar with whiskey process, right? It starts with grain, and it is mashed, it is distilled, and a really crucial aspect of it is that it has to be aged in oak barrel for a minimum number of years, which is prescribed differently in different countries. So, for example, in Canada, it has to be at least 3 years, right? So you cannot even call Canadian whiskey or Canadian spirit a whiskey unless it has been aged in oak barrel for at least 3 years. And so what that means is that whiskey distilleries are not in the best position to follow customer demands. So if customer tastes change, they cannot necessarily adapt quickly because, and in some cases, for example, some of Canada's older distilleries that have been around in some cases for 150 years or more, are sitting on stock of whiskeys that is, sometimes decades old, right? And they keep on bottling it and distilling it and putting it in barrels. And so therefore, there's the things that customers want or consumers want, and then there is the things that distilleries are able to deliver, which is, of course, the case with distilleries all over the world, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the things that we talk about in the paper. That was an important thing we found out, is that materiality, as manifest in this liquid itself, right, which has been produced in a particular way and put in barrel and aged for X number of years, anchors distilleries to the particular stories that they're able to tell, or particular stories that they cannot tell, make some stories more difficult to tell, right? So, for example, consumers for quite some time now have been more and more keen to get whiskey, rye whiskey, basically whiskey made from rye grain. Well, to meet that demand, the distilleries either have to tap into their stocks of aging whiskey if they happen to have that already, or if they don't, they have to distill it, and then they have to age it for at least 3 years. And at that point in time, who knows what the consumers will be wanting, right? Mm-hmm. So therefore, this is a very interesting industry where we see that. But it is a generalizable point that companies are not always able to meet customers where they are, what they currently demand, right? And because of this anchoring of this material endowments and limitations.
Yeah, well, I mean, since we're talking about Canadian whiskey, it's only appropriate to haul out that Canadian quote from Wayne Gretzky about how you don't go to where the puck is, you go to where it's going to be, right? So this is something that these distilleries would be hoping to do, is to, in some way, lead consumer taste, mm-hmm. right? So they can get the customers to where their product is going to be 3 years down the road. Is that something that authenticity can accomplish?
Well, and that is the challenge, of course, is that it's predicting where customer will be is difficult. And oftentimes, impossible, and again, particularly for larger distilleries, right? That need to move large volumes of whiskey, they cannot just keep on adjusting, to sort of, they try to sort of diversify their portfolio of what they're aging, so that they're able to then maybe as taste change, that they can then hopefully figure out how to tap into their reserves and to deliver something that customers want. But it's very difficult for them to do that very, very quickly, because they're very large operations. Some of Canada's largest distilleries, right? They're aging literally millions of barrels of whiskey in their warehouses, right? So it's not always easy for them to do so. Micro distilleries are a little bit in the better position to do so, because they're just doing small experiments and and they don't have large stocks of whiskey. They have opposite problem, actually, that they don't have well-aged whiskey, and so they can kind of trade on experiments, if you will, right? That's essentially like, okay, we have this innovative thing that we are able to offer to customers, and hopefully that will be interesting and innovative enough for them. And that's really what we saw, that the kind of different bases, or kind of different competing bases of authenticity in this industry. So there is the authenticity based on kind of traditionality claims, right? So we're making whiskey in a traditional way, and that's something that was much more likely to be done and much more conducive to large distilleries that have been around, again, for decades, in some cases, more than 150 years. Versus the basis of authenticity around innovation and creativity, or originality, as we call it, and that was much more likely to be practiced by newer micro distilleries. Some of them have been around for just a few years, right? And that's really this anchoring thing that I just mentioned, right? That we found that older, large distilleries tended to be anchored to the traditionality, authenticity claims, right? So it was much easier for them to make that claim, while for the micro distilleries, it was much easier for them to anchor themselves. They were anchored to the originality basis of authenticity, and so that's the kind of claim that they were more likely to be making, and to be making it successfully.
So these are almost like mutually exclusive things: authenticity and originality. Is it an either or is it like a spectrum, or what?
It can be, but of course, businesses don't like that, and it's not really mutually exclusive, but there's a trade-off. Right, and so it places some limits, right? So essentially, some of the older distilleries end up then, because they still want to be able to claim originality, because audiences want that. So they emphasize originality in the sense of maybe coming up with unusual blends of different traditionally made whiskeys. Or kind of more innovative aging regimens, where they might age the whiskey in oak barrel, in kind of more traditional kind of typical oak barrel, and then they might finish it off for another year or two in a barrel that previously held, for example, sherry or some other beverage that would then kind of add some unusual or more interesting notes to the resulting whiskey.
I'm familiar with that from my own research in the field of Scotch, which admittedly is not as rigorous as yours. Can you tell me a little bit about how you went about conducting all this research? I see that you had interviews with corporate executives and so on, and you attended some whiskey festivals. I hope you got to taste some of the whiskey. And you also did observations of the operations. Could you tell me about that?
Absolutely, yeah. So this was quite a bear of a study. It was a lot of work. We did dozens of interviews with whiskey makers, with executives, with their sales representatives, but also very importantly with the audience members, because again, authenticity is in the eye of the beholder, and not all audiences are created equal. So various kind of taste making audiences such as bartenders or whiskey writers or bloggers and so on. So we've tried to get it to as many of them as we could, but we also did a lot of we used a lot of secondary documents, whether it's popular press or social media. But yes, of course, yes, observations of we were fortunate enough to be able to observe how some of these whiskey makers do their work and see how they run their day-to-day operations, specifically how they like how they distill stuff, how they bottle it, how they age it, and so on and so forth, right? But also the festivals that you mentioned were quite important for us to be able to actually see how they interact with audiences as well, right? So who the distillery sends to represent the distillery, so for example, some whiskey distilleries will send their master blender, who is a real expert, who is really close to the production process and tends to be able to convey a lot of kind of tacit knowledge to audiences about how a particular whiskey was made, and versus other distilleries that may not be able to do so. They might send a sales rep, who may have learned a lot of important things about whiskey making, but is not nearly as close to the process, right? And so, for example, so that's one of the things that was quite important for us to see this. Having a kind of very knowledgeable representative from a distillery who's very close to the production process tended to resonate with audiences much more, and to convince and to give them a sense that that this particular distillery and this particular products from the distilleries are authentic, as opposed to distilleries that were not able to to put somebody like that forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, this leads us to the question of how you would like to see this paper taken up in industry, what people can learn from it, because there's this notion of closeness in relation to authenticity. Can you tell me how these whiskey producers manage or emphasize closeness in relation to authenticity?
Absolutely. This is an excellent and really important question, right? And so we distinguish in the paper here between two types of closeness: corporeal and physical. Right? Corporeal is basically and these are not mutually exclusive, by the way. And so corporeal closeness is basically kind of having some kind of an expert, who is close to the production process and is able to kind of share this tacit knowledge about whiskey making to represent the distillery and kind of speak to audiences.
Right, so that's that first-hand account kind of thing.
Yes, somebody who's able to offer that kind of first-hand account from a hands-on expert point of view.
So it's in your example, the sales rep who knows about the company but isn't first-hand on the shop floor has less authenticity than the person who's actually working on the shop floor.
Absolutely,
Closeness.
exactly.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And then physical authenticity is sort of kind of trying to reduce, I guess, the boundaries and break down the walls as much as possible, of course, between audiences and the distilleries. Kind of inviting them in to enable audiences to see the production process as closely as possible, right? So whether it involves more kind of structured tours around the production facilities, or sometimes, just the way the physical design of the distillery tends to facilitate this. So, for example, some of the newer micro distilleries would have like glass walls that, while people are hanging out at the boutique sampling whiskeys, they can see the stills behind the glass wall and kind of see people working in them and so on, right? So, of course, these are not mutually exclusive, right? But of course, they tend to manifest in a little bit different way, right? And so physical authenticity, I think, is particularly important because, again, to the extent there's, as we all know, you can tell me stuff, but I'm much more convinced if you can show me the stuff. So physical authenticity really kind of gets at the physical closeness, I should say, gets into the really kind of showing the stuff much more. Corporeal authenticity is very important as well, and it can also enable a distillery to sort of to kind of expand the radius, right? So obviously not everybody is able to visit the distillery and see what's happening there, but yeah, you can send your master blender or your distiller to a trade show somewhere, and so that people actually get to put a face to the name, and they actually talk to the person, and the person can actually tell them things that they are doing, right? And there's tremendous difference between distilleries in their ability to do this and willingness really to do this.
Right. Yeah. And it's also what we refer to in accounting, which is my field, as a costly signal, because you're taking one of your most important people from the factory floor where they're needed and sending them off to some sort of a trade event.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is one of the reasons that many of the kind of older, more established distilleries are not able or willing to do that. And this is why sometimes actually, this is one of the surprising things actually found early on in the study, that even though some of these larger distilleries had been around, again, for decades at least, in some cases, more than 100 years, the larger distilleries oftentimes had the perception among key audiences as being less authentic than some of these newer distilleries that had been around only for a couple of years, and we're still kind of learning their craft, and we're just experimenting in some cases. And I think this is one of the reasons, right? So because the micro distilleries were just in much better position they were simple organizations, like, let's say 4 people running the whole organization versus, hundreds of people working in an organization. So it's much easier for them to sort of invite people in and see the facilities, and B, when they show up, and who are they greeting? Well, they're greeting the distiller, for example, the master blender, who is, when they're not interacting with customers, they're spending most of the time, actually making the whiskey, right? Whereas, of course, larger distilleries, they have, their corporate structure, they have division of labor, and so until recently, most established distilleries or older distilleries didn't even appreciate the importance actually of having their master blender or their distiller interface with audiences.
Yeah. Well, so this raises for me the question of what kinds of industries this insight would apply to. So obviously the distillery industry, the whiskey industry, I can think of chocolate makers. You could have a big factory that produces chocolates, or you could have a small boutique chocolate maker where you can watch them work through the window. Coffee shops, that sort of thing. Microbreweries for beer, right?
Yeah.
The hipster's choice of which brand is cool this month. What about other industries, though? Does this extend to others?
Of course. Naturally, industries that produce what's known as experience goods, such as the examples you've given, the beer, the wine, the chocolate, other kind of more upscale agricultural products. Of course, those are the most obvious places, right? But the thing is that authenticity is important in all sorts of contexts, right? So some of the case-specific things that we talk about in our study, because we needed to tell a credible and rich story of whiskey industry. So those may not necessarily apply, but for example, basis of authenticity, right? Traditionality versus originality, right? This is important in, ironically, something as different from this industry as high-tech industries of various sorts, right? Where, for example, as entrepreneurs try to pitch their ideas to the prospective investors, they need to figure out how to strike that balance, between being traditional, right, and therefore because that gives them a sense of credibility, versus being original. So it's not just me too kind of product, not me too kind of solution, not me too kind of app, right? And they need to do so in an authentic way. So again, so that the audiences, or in this case, investors, can buy it and say, yes, this is credible. I see that you are authentic, that you're doing, that this is genuine representation of what your business is or will be doing, right? So that's just another example. But again, we see it everywhere that really authenticity matters, right? And the other really key thing, right, is this point about the importance of materiality, right? Nowadays, since we spend so much time online in virtual world, and we work from home and we socialize from home, etc., sometimes we forget that we are still living in a material world, right? And such things as technology, for example, right? So in the paper we talk about this idea of affordances, right? So how the different kinds of materiality in the case of that particular study, production equipment, etc., has certain affordances, meaning it makes certain stories easier to tell while others harder to tell. Well, affordances, actually, the very idea of affordances we borrowed from studies of technology, right? And so, because, for example, such things as, social media, what it enables people to do and not do, right? This is driven very much by the affordances of the different platforms and the algorithms, right? So, whether algorithms boost or damper particular kinds of ideas or particular types of claims or particular types of stories from particular type of people, right? So I think this is a reminder, right, that really the materiality matters, right, in a variety of contexts. It is a particularly important in our context, where essentially the ultimate judgment of whether a whiskey is authentic or not from audience point of view is they take a sip of this liquid, right, and they feel something authentic or they don't, right? But in more remote contexts where this materiality sort of is not as visible, not as salient, it still matters a lot.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could flip this around for me for just a second as we move towards wrapping up. And just think about this from the position of the individual consumer. How do you know when a corporation is actually authentic and as opposed to maybe you're being manipulated by some romantic notion of what it takes to make whiskey or what it takes to make chocolate?
Yeah. No, this is a really challenging question. And honestly, all the years of research on authenticity have actually made me more skeptical about the very use of notion of authenticity, right? Because I realize that oftentimes when putting myself in the shoes of a consumer or an audience member, the reality is that the times when I feel like I'm having authentic experience are ironically the times when I'm most likely to be manipulated, right? Because that's when this materiality and narrative come together most fluidly, and voila, they got me, right? So in a sense, in general, and this is something that I've been talking to a variety of audiences, is that maybe we should be, as consumers, and actually more importantly than consumers, citizens in the society, maybe we should spend a little bit less time chasing authenticity, right? Maybe we should try to, for example, when we are making a purchase, maybe we should think a little bit more about, am I having an authentic experience here? But what is the quality of this thing that I'm buying, right? Or if I'm choosing, a controversial tangent over here, if I'm choosing a elected politician, or if I'm deciding whether my manager is an authentic leader, maybe I should actually flip it off and say, you know what? I shouldn't be asking this question at all. If I'm looking at a politician, why don't I ask if I like the policies? If the manager, maybe I say, well, what are they actually good at their job, right? Like, should I really care that they're an authentic leader, or should I really care if they're good at the job and are they helping me do my job?
Good questions. Thank you for talking to me about this study, Maxim. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, Cam. Really appreciate that.
Have you got any new papers coming out or any new grants for conducting research that you could tell us about?
Well, there's several things that we're working on. So there's one thing that I'm quite excited about that is being led by a PhD student of ours. We are working on a very early stages study on on this what's known as indoor clean air movement, right? So as pandemic kind of made it very clear for us that viruses such as COVID and many others are transmitted in an airborne manner, and there's a lot of science that has backed it up. And so what we're studying here is some of these movements that have organized to try to push politicians and other decision makers to improve indoor air quality in a variety of public settings, whether it's in schools and hospitals and so on. So that's one study that we're in very early stages so far, but I'm quite excited about. Then I'm also working with a PhD student from University of Toronto on a paper that explores the role of middle managers and their ability to tell convincing and persuasive narratives in their and how that influences the success or failure of the organization's DEI initiatives. And then there is the paper that kind of in a more public domain, or not public domain, but more sort of general public outreach front that was published in Scientific American with a co-author from Stanford, Marianne Cooper, that explores how we are collectively, as a society, unfortunately, learning to become more sophisticated at denying some of the most disturbing, some of the most threatening things that are happening around us, whether it's the lingering effects of the pandemic or ongoing climate change crisis, and how we are learning to sort of normalize it and turn what sort of we would call the garbage can fire. Sorry, the garbage fire. What's the term now? Garbage fire. Yes.
Yeah, garbage can fire works for me.
Garbage can fire. Yes. Yeah. Moment into something that's normal and manageable even, and something that we're okay with.
It sounds like you are reaching out into a bunch of different diverse areas. That's really lovely to see. I always appreciate a colleague who's got some breadth, not just depth, but breadth as well. So this is nice to see. Where can people find you, Maxim?
Well, I have a website, maximvoronov.net, where I have put up a variety of published papers. I'm, of course, also on LinkedIn and on Twitter, though I'm not really active anymore. I'm kind of trying to get off. And I'm kind of trying to do more on Blue Sky. And so, so if people want to look for familiar faces and names on Blue Sky, please look me up.
All right.
I'm there.
Good. Well, I'll provide links to those in the webpage and in the show notes. Thanks, Maxim. Really a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks so much, Cam, for having me and for this really engaging discussion. Really appreciate it.
Wonderful.